The ship had been falling apart when they took her, and Lily remembered the screams of her crew as alien soldiers tore through the hull like paper, and she remembered fighting back with everything she had, but there were too many of them, and they hit her with something that made the world go dark. She woke up in a cell made of bones. For 17 days, she sat in that cage and watched other prisoners get dragged away, and none of them ever came back. And the guards were tall creatures with too many eyes, and they laughed at her when she demanded to know where her people were, and they told her nothing. On the 18th day they came for her. They dragged her through tunnels that smelled like death and old blood, and then suddenly she was standing in bright light, and the roar of a crowd hit her like a wave, and she was in an arena, and the ground beneath her feet was made from the ribs of some giant dead thing. Thousands of aliens sat in the stands above her, and they were screaming for blood, and she knew whose blood they wanted, but one figure caught her eye. High above the chaos on a throne that seemed to be made of frozen starlight sat an elven woman, and she was the most beautiful and terrifying thing Lily had ever seen, and her hair was silver like moonlight, and it moved on its own, like smoke in a breeze, and her eyes burned gold like dying suns. And beside her was a dragon. It was not like the dragons from old Earth stories, and this creature was something else entirely, and its scales shifted between living flesh and liquid metal, and smoke curled from its nostrils, and it watched Lily with eyes that held ancient intelligence. They called the elf Seraphina the Hollow, and Lily had heard whispers of her name in the cells, and the other prisoners spoke of her like she was death itself, and they said she had conquered 47 worlds, and they said she had never lost a battle, and they said she had no heart left inside her chest. The gates on the other side of the arena opened. 3 warriors walked out, and they were Krath soldiers, and each one stood 8 feet tall, and their bodies were covered in hard shells that gleamed with oil, and they carried axes that hummed with plasma energy, and any one of them could have killed Lily without trying. She had nothing. No weapon and no armor, and nothing but her fists and her fury and her absolute refusal to die in this place far from everything she loved. The first Krath charged at her with its axe raised high. Lily moved. She had trained her whole life for combat, and the military academy had taught her every fighting style humanity had ever invented, and she had studied alien physiology for years, and she knew exactly where the Krath were weak. She dove under the axe swing, and her foot connected with the back of the warrior's knee joint, and there was a crack, and the creature screamed and fell. The second Krath came at her from behind, but she was already spinning, and she grabbed its arm and used its own momentum against it, and she twisted and pulled, and the shoulder came apart with a wet pop. The third one was smarter, and it circled her slowly, and it swung its axe in careful arcs, and Lily watched and waited, and when it overextended, she darted forward and grabbed the ceremonial sash around its neck, and she wrapped it tight and pulled and squeezed until the creature stopped moving. The arena went silent. Lily stood alone in the center, surrounded by 3 defeated warriors, and she was covered in purple alien blood, and her chest heaved with each breath, and her hands were shaking, but she was alive. She looked up at the throne. The elven woman had leaned forward, and her golden eyes were fixed on Lily, and there was something in her expression that Lily could not read, and the dragon beside her had lifted its massive head, and smoke poured from its mouth. And then Seraphina spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, but somehow Lily heard every word as if they were standing right next to each other, and the elf said, "I wish you were my partner." Their eyes met across the impossible distance, and in that moment, something changed, and Lily felt it in her bones, and she knew that her life would never be the same, and she knew that this strange, silver-haired woman, with the dragon at her side, was going to change everything. The guards came for her then, but they did not drag her back to the cells, and instead they led her toward the throne, and toward the woman who had whispered those words, and toward a war that would reshape the entire galaxy. Lily did not know it yet, but she had just become the most important human in the universe. The room existed outside of normal space, and Lily could feel it in her stomach, like the universe had folded itself wrong, and the walls seemed to breathe, and the window looked out onto a nebula being born with new stars igniting like scattered fire. Serafina stood at that window with her back to Lily and the dragon. Nyx lay curled at her feet, and both of them watched the human with careful eyes. "You are wondering why you are still alive," the elf said without turning around. Lily kept her voice steady and said, "The thought crossed my mind. The Velkari Empire took you from a colony ship, and Serafina finally turned, and her silver hair caught light that should not exist, and there were 37,000 humans on that ship, and they harvested all of you for the slave markets." Something cold settled in Lily's chest, and she asked, "Where are they now?" "Alive." And Serafina walked closer, and she moved like water and like a predator and like something that had learned to be dangerous over centuries. And for now, they are alive, but the Emperor is keeping them as leverage against me. Why would he use my people against you? Because I have been fighting this empire for 300 years, and the elf stopped just a few feet away and up close. Lily could see the exhaustion in her golden eyes and could see the weight of centuries pressing down on her. "And I have watched civilizations burn, and I have become the monster they fear, because it was the only way to survive." The dragon Nyx made a low sound, and Lily looked at her, and the creature was massive and beautiful and terrifying all at once, and her scales rippled between organic tissue and gleaming metal. "She likes you," and Serafina sounded surprised, "and she has never liked anyone but me. What do you want from me?" "A partnership," and the word hung in the air between them, and Serafina continued and said, "The Emperor is planning something, and he is building a weapon that will end the rebellion forever, and I need someone to help me stop him." "Why me?" "Because I watched you fight in that arena, and you should have died, and every calculation said you would die, but you did not, and you fought with something I have not seen in a very long time." "And what is that?" Hope Lily let the words settle, and then she asked, "What happened to your hope?" Serafina was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "The Velkari took my homeworld, and they turned my own people against me, and they made me watch as everything I loved burned, and I have been running and fighting ever since, and Nyx is the only one who stayed with me." The dragon lifted her head and pressed it against Serafina's side, and Lily saw the bond between them, and it was something deep and old and unbreakable. "Help me save your people," and Serafina met Lily's eyes, "and help me end this war, and in return I will give you everything I have." Before Lily could answer, the room shook, and alarms began to scream, and Nyx was on her feet in an instant, and her wings spread wide, and her body shifted into something sharper and more deadly. "They found us," and Serafina breathed, and somehow they found us, through cracks forming in the walls. Lily could see ships, and hundreds of them surrounded the pocket dimension like wolves, circling wounded prey. "Can you fight?" Lily asked. Serafina smiled, and it was terrible and beautiful, and she said, "I have been fighting since before your species discovered fire." She raised her hand, and Nyx transformed, and she did not become larger, but instead she became armor, and her scales wrapped around Serafina's body like a second skin, and her wings became a cape of living shadow. "Stay close to me, human," and Serafina's voice now carried the resonance of dragon fire, and this is going to get violent. Lily had no weapon and no armor, but she had made her decision, and she said, "Then let's go." Together they walked toward the battle and toward the war, and toward a future neither of them could see. Yet the battle lasted 3 days and 3 nights. Lily saw things she would never forget, and she watched Serafina move through enemy ships like a ghost, and she watched Nyx breathe fire that somehow burned in the vacuum of space, and she watched the elf fight with 300 years of rage and grief and desperate hope. They destroyed 17 warships together, and they saved 6 transport vessels full of refugees. And they could not save the 7th. Lily found Serafina afterwards in the wreckage of a destroyed cruiser. and the elf had dismissed the dragon armor, and Nyx had curled her massive body around them both to keep them warm in the freezing void, and Seraphina was crying. She did not make any sound, but the tears ran down her silver cheeks, and her hands were shaking, and Lily realized that the legendary monster of the Velkari Empire was just a woman who had been alone for far too long. They were children on that ship, and Seraphina's voice was barely a whisper, and I could not reach them in time. You saved 6 ships, but not the 7th. Lily moved closer, and after a moment of hesitation, she took Seraphina's hand, and the elf flinched like she had been burned. And Lily understood that no one had touched her with kindness in a very long time. My people called me their protector once, and Seraphina spoke without looking at Lily. And I was young then and foolish, and I thought I could save everyone. What happened? The Velkari happened, and they do not just conquer worlds, and they consume them. And they took everything from me, and they made me into this. And she gestured at herself, and I became the hollow. Because I had to be empty of everything except rage. Nyx made a soft rumbling sound and pressed her head against Seraphina's side, and the dragon had been with her through all of it, and Lily realized that this ancient creature loved the elf as fiercely as any family I have known you for 3 days, Lily said quietly. And I have already seen you save thousands of lives and destroy an imperial dreadnought and cry when you thought no one was watching because you could not save everyone. Seraphina pulled her hand away and said you should not have seen that. Why not? Because I am supposed to be the monster, and her voice cracked. And if they see weakness, they will stop believing, and belief is the only weapon we have left. Lily was quiet for a moment, and then she said, You asked me to be your partner, and did you mean it? I meant that I saw something in you and Seraphina, finally met her eyes, and in the arena you fought like someone who had something worth dying for. I do, and Lily stood and pulled Seraphina up with her and my people and my home and my stubborn refusal to let the universe win. The elf almost smiled and asked, What is humanity's greatest strength? We are too stupid to know when we are beaten. Seraphina laughed, and it was a real laugh, and it surprised them both, and Nyx lifted her head and made a sound that might have been dragon laughter too. Then let us stop surviving and start winning. And Lily held out her hand. And you have 300 years of experience, and I have humanity's gift for impossible victories. Seraphina looked at the offered hand, and then she took it and said together. And in the darkness between the stars, surrounded by wreckage and enemies and impossible odds, something new was born, and it was not just an alliance, and it was not just a partnership, and it was the beginning of a friendship that would change the galaxy forever. Nyx wrapped her wings around them both, and for the first time in 300 years, Seraphina did not feel alone. They found the weapon 6 weeks later, and it was not what any of them expected. It was not a bomb, and it was not a fleet, and it was not a machine of destruction, and it was a child. Her name was Maya, and she was 7 years old, and she had been taken from Lily's colony ship along with 37,000 other humans, and the Velkari had discovered something in her blood, and something in her mind, and something that should not exist in such a young species. Maya could see the threads of reality, and she could pull them apart and weave them back together, and in the wrong hands, she could unravel existence itself. They have been experimenting on her, and Seraphina's voice was cold with fury as they reviewed the intelligence Nyx had gathered, and they are trying to weaponize her abilities, and the Emperor plans to use her to collapse rebel-held space into a singularity. Lily's hands were shaking, and she said, She is a child. She is a weapon to them. And the elf replied, And nothing more. Then we get her out. The Emperor's fortress is impenetrable, and Seraphina pulled up images of a structure that made Lily's blood run cold, and I have tried to breach it 43 times, and 43 times I have watched allies die against those walls. Then we do not breach it. and Lily studied the fortress layout, and her tactical training was working faster than it ever had before, and we walk through the front door. Explain, the Emperor wants you dead more than anything else, does he not? I have been a thorn in his side for 3 centuries, and yes, he wants me dead. Then we give him what he wants. And Lily looked at Seraphina with fierce determination. And you surrender, and publicly and completely, and you walk into his throne room, and you kneel. Seraphina stared at her and said, that is suicide. It is a distraction, and while every eye in the Empire is watching you, I infiltrate the facility where they are keeping Maya and I get her out. And then what? Then I give you a signal, and you show them why they should have killed you when they had the chance. Nyx lifted her head and looked at Lily with something like respect, and smoke curled from her nostrils. This plan is insane, and Seraphina said, I know we will probably all die. Probably the elf was quiet for a long moment, and then she reached out and touched Lily's face, and the gesture was so gentle and so unexpected that Lily forgot to breathe. I have waited 300 years for someone brave enough to fight beside me, and Seraphina whispered, and not behind me, and not for me, but beside me. Then let us end this war. And together they spent 2 weeks preparing, and Lily memorized every corridor of the fortress, and every guard rotation, and every possible escape route, and Seraphina sent word to the Emperor that she was ready to surrender, and the galaxy held its breath. On the day of the surrender, Seraphina dressed in white, and Nyx walked beside her, and they looked like ghosts, approaching the gates of the underworld. Lily watched them go, and then she began her mission. She moved through shadows, and through ventilation shafts, and through spaces so small she had to dislocate her own shoulder to fit through, and the pain was nothing compared to the fire in her heart. She found Maya in a room that hurt to look at, and the child was suspended in a web of crystallized energy, and her eyes were open but empty, and frozen. Tears marked her cheeks. Hey, and Lily kept her voice soft, and hey, sweetheart, and I am here to take you home. Maya focused slowly and asked, Are you real? I am real, and I am getting you out of here. They want me to break things. And Maya's voice was tiny and terrified, and they put pictures in my head of worlds breaking apart, and I do not want to break things. You do not have to. And Lily began disabling the containment field, and not ever again. And can you walk, I think? So good, because we need to run. Lily lifted Maya in her arms and began moving toward the extraction point, and above them the most dangerous part of the plan was about to begin. The Emperor's throne room was built from the crushed heart of a dead star, and cold radiated from every surface, and the darkness here was alive and hungry. Seraphina walked through the massive doors, with her head held high, and Nyx padded beside her, and every step echoed like thunder, and thousands of Imperial soldiers lined the walls, and all of them wanted her dead. The Emperor sat on his throne, and he was not a creature of flesh and blood, but something vast and incomprehensible, and his voice came from everywhere at once. Seraphina the Hollow, and at last I have come to surrender. So I have been told, and 300 years, and it ends not with fire but with a whimper, and I expected more from you. Seraphina knelt and bowed her head, and inside she was counting seconds. Far below, in the detention levels, Lily ran through corridors that were falling apart, and alarms screamed, and guards shouted, and she held Maya tight against her chest, and the child had her face buried in Lily's shoulder, almost there, and Lily whispered, And almost there, sweetheart. Maya lifted her head and said, The threads are singing, and something big is about to happen. Above them, Seraphina continued her performance, and the Emperor gloated and told her of all the ways he would make her suffer, and all the ways he would destroy everything she had built, and Seraphina let him talk, and all the while she reached through her bond with Nyx and waited. Lily's voice came through the quantum link, and one word, and now Seraphina smiled. You know what your problem is, and she rose from her knees, and you forgot what I was before I was the hollow. And what was that? Nyx began to transform, and not into armor this time, but into something ancient and terrible. And her body grew and expanded and became a storm of scales and fire and fury. I was Hope, and Seraphina raised her hand, and golden light erupted from her palm, and Hope does not kneel. The throne room exploded into chaos. Seraphina and Nyx fought like nothing the Empire had ever seen, and they were 300 years of rage unleashed, and they were fire and shadow and death incarnate. And the Emperor screamed orders, but his soldiers fell like leaves before a hurricane. Below them, Lily burst through the final door and found herself in a hangar filled with ships, and 37,000 humans were already flooding in, and they had been freed from their cells by Maya's awakening power, and they were fighting back with fists and stolen weapons, and the pure fury of people who refused to be slaves. Lily found a ship and got Maya inside, and she began powering up the engines, and all around her humans were doing the same, and they were escaping, and they were surviving, and they were winning. The fortress began to collapse, and the Emperor was falling, and his power was breaking apart, and Seraphina flew through the destruction on Nyx's back, and she was laughing and crying at the same time. They escaped into open space, and behind them the fortress crumbled into nothing, and the Emperor was gone and the war was over. Hours later, they gathered on the bridge of a captured dreadnought, and Lily stood at the window and watched stars drift past, and Maya slept peacefully between piles of blankets, and Nyx had curled herself around all of them like a protective wall. Seraphina came to stand beside Lily, and for a long time neither of them spoke. "What happens now?" And Lily finally asked. "Now we rebuild," and Seraphina looked at the stars, and for the first time in 300 years, they looked like possibility instead of prison, and together, the galaxy is going to need time to heal. We have time, and Seraphina turned to face her, and I have time, and I watched you fight barehanded in that arena. And I knew you were the one I had been waiting for, a partner more than that, and the elf took Lily's hand, and a friend. Nyx rumbled happily, and Maya murmured in her sleep, and somewhere in the vast darkness of space, a new chapter was beginning. They would face new enemies and new challenges, and the scars of war would take generations to heal, but they would face it together. And an ancient elf who had forgotten how to hope, and a human who refused to stop fighting, and a child who could see reality itself, and a dragon whose loyalty had never wavered. This was their story, and it was only the beginning.